Welcome to Birkbeck Arts Week Online. I'm Julia Bell, the course director of the MA Creative Writing at Birkbeck. And this event is part of our MA summer term lectures, but also an event that's shared with Arts Week and therefore for everybody to watch. I'm really happy today that we're welcoming Lily Dunn and Zoe Gilbert, who are the editors of a new anthology, Wild and Precious Life. And also 3 of the contributors to this anthology who are going to read some of the works that they've published in the book: Michael Loveday, Katie Watson, and Michelle Kirsch. And just to give you some background, the book, A Wild and Precious Life, which is published by Unbound on May the 13th, is an anthology of recovery stories that evolved from a creative writing class at Hackney Recovery Service affiliated with St Mungo's, which some of you might know because it's just around the corner from Birkbeck. And the class was for a group of people recovering from addiction to drugs and alcohol, and it was led by Lily and Zoe. And the classes were so successful that they were awarded an Arts Council grant to continue the teaching, and also then to do a nationwide call out for stories, which then resulted in this anthology. And then they were signed up by Unbound, which offers a kind of new collective publishing model, which asks the authors to raise the funds to pay for the book before it's published. So this is one of the things I really want to talk to them about. And by asking people to pledge for the book in advance, you guarantee that there will be readers for the book as well as building the profile. So Lily Dunn is an author and a mentor, and also my PhD student. Her personal essays have appeared in Granta, Hinterland, Litro, and A Real Story in the UK. And she's also a regular writer for Aeon magazine, which many of you might know, writes fantastic pieces for that. Her first novel, Shadowing the Sun, was published by Portobello Books, and she's the co-editor of this anthology. And her memoir about the legacy of her father's various addictions is going to be published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson in the spring of 2022. And she teaches creative writing at Bath Spa and co-runs with Zoe Gilbert, the London Lit Lab. And Zoe Gilbert is the author of 2 novels, Folk, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2018, and Mischief Acts, which is coming also in 2022. And her short stories have been broadcast on the BBC, published internationally, and won prizes, including the Costa Short Story Award. And she's the co-director of the London Lit Lab, which teaches and mentors creative writers. And then Michelle Kirsch is the author of Clean, a memoir about addiction, recovery, and the removal of stubborn stains. Clean won the Royal Society Literature Christopher Bland Prize in 2020, which is awarded to first-time published writers over 50. She now works part-time in a recording studio and is working on her first novel, Wig, about the lives of 3 people all trying to hide something during the mad, hot, crazy New York summer of 1977. And she says she loves reading, writing, her family, and really loud music. Me too. Michael Loveday is a flash fiction writer and poet, and he works as an editor and a coach for writers and artists. He's also a visiting lecturer, and his most recent publication is the hybrid novella in flash, 3 Men on the Edge, which was shortlisted for the Saboteur Best Novella Award. Be really interested to know a bit more about that. I've got some students who are writing some fantastic flash fiction recently. And he's currently working on a second manuscript and has a craft guide to the novella in flash forthcoming from Ad Hoc Fiction later in 2021. And Katie Watson, who we're hoping was going to join us shortly, has worked in the charitable sector with vulnerable and disadvantaged adults, and is also a qualified teacher. And she was awarded a scholarship to train as a trauma-informed writing guide for Write Yourself, a global writing movement aimed at supporting women to reclaim their stories after experiencing trauma. She's the first guide based in the UK to be trained in this methodology. So I'd be interested to talk to her about that too in relation to this particular book. She's also a published writer, and in 2017 she was runner-up in Miss Lexia's prestigious Women's International Poetry Competition. So I'm really glad to be able to talk to all of you today about this really wonderful book. But Lily and Zoe, I'm going to come to you first, I think, and just ask you, you talk about the book as evolving. Is this something that evolved over a period of years? So how did this project evolve? Perhaps Lily, you can start.
Yeah. Well, it really did evolve. It was a strange kind of looking back, just thinking it took many years, but it definitely sort of created its own trajectory in a way. I mean, it came from a kind of weird sort of compulsive need in that my father had died. Well, my father had died sometime during, he'd been dead sometime during that period, but he died of alcoholism very tragically. And I was going through a separation, and I felt my marriage was separating, and I felt this sort of weird sort of need to offer myself voluntarily to teach creative writing in some form. And so I found myself kind of phoning around all these recovery services in Hackney, which is where I lived, and asking if they wanted to set up a creative writing class. And I think it was the first person that I spoke to happened to be who became my supervisor, Alex. And he said, oh, that's really strange because we have a gap in our schedule. And yes, we really want to do creative writing. So yeah, come along. So it all just felt so fortuitous and easy. And so I went along, and before I knew it, I was teaching a group of recovering addicts. And again, you know, I was quite at the beginning of my teaching at that point. And I sort of, I don't know, I just sort of went into it quite instinctively, and the group worked really well. We had some really strong writers, or people who were very prepared to go to difficult places in their writing. You know, they were going through therapy and in abstinence programs. And so they were quite used to really looking at themselves, you know, barely looking at themselves nakedly. So what was created was a very kind of dynamic group of people who were just producing great stuff and bonding with each other. And the group became very necessary for all of us, actually. And it helped me as well with what I was going through. So then, yeah, and then it progressed, and they wanted me to continue, but after 6 weeks, I sort of, because I wasn't getting paid, I started the application process to the Arts Council and got Zoe involved when we got some money to carry on teaching. So yeah, I mean that was the beginning of it.
And the Arts Council money gave you money to carry on just doing the teaching. It paid for you to carry on delivering the groups.
It did, but we also had to factor in something that would be far more far-reaching, because with the Arts Council, they want to feel that we're getting to a wider audience. So that was where me and Zoe came up with the idea of doing an anthology. Do you remember that, Zoe? Whether us sort of coming up with that idea?
Yes, and it's seeming like a crazily big thing to do. Like the words national call out sounds so grand. You know, the idea of just asking people we didn't know to send us stuff. I think it's been such an astounding thing seeing the work that happens just in that small group in Hackney, actually. It was surprising, the quality and the variety, and how, as Lily said, the kind of a certain amount of self-awareness and willingness to go somewhere emotional meant that there was so much amazing, powerful writing, and it wasn't all sad, it was often funny, you know, and it was such a pleasure to see that. And a lot of the writing was about recovery and a lot of it wasn't, but they were just such an inspiring group that I guess that gave us the confidence to think that we could find this work, and that recovery writing didn't just have to be one kind of thing.
Yes,
it's definitely a big factor in how the anthology works, because it's so various. We had a lot of fun figuring out how to arrange the pieces roughly under headings, which you'll see when you get the book, but that slightly subvert your expectations about what a story about recovery might be. And again, I think the amount of humour and energy in it was amazing, and kind of transfixed us when we first looked at the submissions, didn't it, Lily? Apart from the quality as well.
Can I just pick you up on that one thing you said, that subvert my expectations of what you think a recovery story might be? I'm going to push you a bit on that. What do you mean? What would be what's my expectation? I'm curious to think. I mean, I don't know. So
yeah, well, I can only speak for what my expectations would be, and I think my expectations were narrower before we began this than they are now. And I would have expected there to be a lot more just plain misery, and that's not the case at all. And that's, you know, we thought, gosh, there's going to be a big emotional process that we will go through reading this work when we were trying to select pieces, and obviously it was incredibly emotional because people are being honest and raw, but also it was every emotion not just the sort of, my God, the struggle
Yes,
type
yes.
emotion. And I, you know, that's what's made it so exciting, and what makes the book the book wonderful to read, that it does ask you to go to difficult places, but not in the same way every time. And people who've written pieces for the book have found that very particular, the literary way of approaching this material, I suppose, is one way of putting it, finding the angle and the distance and the frame to tell a story that seems to have come very naturally to the people whose work we chose to put in the book. So while it's from the heart, it's also something that's being held up at a distance as a piece of art.
Yes, 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 yes.
That was just something that we very quickly identified when we were doing the submission process, was those pieces that felt too close and too cathartic and too unprocessed, compared to the ones that just had that element of distance, that, you know, that someone was able to have a joke, or, you know, just or be more critical or more reflective, or, you know, whatever it was. And that became very, very apparent actually once we identified that.
Yes, I'm interested just to hear a little bit about the process of the Unbound process, about how you went about doing this collective project through this particular publishing model. It's quite new, I think, and quite interesting.
Yeah, so we had our anthology, and this was, you know, a couple of years into the project, and then it was like, oh, what are we going to do with this? We've got to try and find a publisher. And so we did approach some small presses, and because we didn't, I mean, actually I did approach a couple of mainstream as well, but we were doing it through contacts. We didn't do it through an agent, so we had to, you know, go directly to them. And we had some interesting feedback, but nobody took it up. But we knew about Unbound, but it was very easy again with them. We sent it in, I think, and then, or I might have had a phone conversation. I think that was what was nice about it, was that actually I could speak to somebody. And I think I phoned up and spoke to one of the editors, and they said, oh, I really like the idea of this book. And I think also because Unbound take books on commission, you know, they'll take an idea rather than a finished product. So by the time we went in to have a meeting with them, you know, they hadn't read the entire book, but we actually had the book. So there was no sort of, you know, long lead time in terms of our delivery. But they had faith in us, and they did take it on the basis of the idea. And so then, yeah, I mean, that was all quite straightforward, wasn't it, Zoe? We had to have a few meetings with them, and then we started the crowdfunding process. We went for the most expensive crowdfunding, because it was always, for me, it was always that I wanted a hardback. I wanted it to look really special. I didn't want it to be, you know, something that you can only get online. So we just went, like, you know, we went for the big grand statement, and you know, obviously, which was quite challenging when it came to raising those funds, but we had to raise £16,000.
Well, that's no easy feat, because you're creating an audience before the book's been published, which is not usually the way that it's done. A big publishing company publishes something on spec and then hopes the audience will follow, whereas this is a bona fide kind of effort to build a community around the project that you've done. Do you feel like you've done that? I mean, I get the sense that there's quite a strong community around this project.
I think we've done that. We'd certainly got a lot of excitement up with, you know, we did most of our crowdfunding on Twitter and relied on contributors. That, you know, they were very much a part of that. And we built a very sort of strong network of contributors who were helping retweet and make contacts and get people involved. And then, yeah, it definitely, you know, you get peaks of it when someone might RT something, retweet something, and it gets to, I mean, we had Neil Gaiman, didn't we, at one point, and that was all really exciting. And so, yeah, we definitely have built up a community, and people are excited and looking forward to seeing the book. So I think that is one of the really nice benefits of having that long lead time. You know, there's sort of a built up excitement, definitely.
Yeah, no, I'm excited that it's finally coming out, because another thing about the crowdfunding thing is that a book can exist as a project in a kind of abstract sense for quite a long time, because you're doing all the fundraising and you're almost doing all the publicity before the book comes out. So yeah,
which is a sort of strange feeling, because we have had pockets of a lot of publicity. Like we did a thing with the BBC, and we did, there were quite a few articles were coming out when we were doing the crowdfunding. And it's a bit daunting, isn't it, Zoe, that now we're kind of entering into book coming out, and it's like, oh my God, that means we've got to do it again. But but we're going to try and get the contributors on board for that as well.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, to the point where I think when we finally got given a publication date, it felt quite unreal. But the other thing that finally happens is that all these pieces of work that are in the book are out in the world, and they've waited, some of them, dormant on those digital pages for this moment. And so going back and looking at them again and realizing that actually the point of it coming out is that all of these people now have their work in the book, whether it's the first time or absolutely not the first time. And it's that's interesting. And we can sort of hopefully lean back and say our work here is done to some extent, because the work speaks for itself, and we've been project managers as much as editors.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing generally about the sort of publishing experience, and those of you that have published before know this, that the book comes out 2 years after you finished it, and you think you forget about it, and then it finally comes out and you have to sort of do the publicity circuit and talk about it. And if to you it was work that you did a few years ago, and suddenly it's coming out again into the light, which is always a really interesting process. I want to bring in the contributors now, seeing as we've got them here. I don't know who wants to speak first, but I'd really like to know something about your relationship with this book, and then also perhaps to broaden that out a bit and to talk a bit more about this issue of writing and recovery, and how writing can help, or does it help, and is there a way in which we can marry those two ideas of writing both as art and as something which can be therapeutic? Shall I pick on somebody, or does somebody want to speak first? Michelle, maybe? Sorry, I put you on mute, so do unmute. Did I unmute you? Sorry. For some reason, it's not doing it.
Yeah, that's it.
How's that?
That's fine. We can hear you.
Yeah,
Hello.
Okay. This was a really interesting process. First of all, as you said, there was quite a disconnect time-wise between the writing of it and where we're at now. So it's, having had a look at what I wrote several years ago, is a bit, most people can relate to that. But there's also a kind of a strange relationship between the type of recovery that I do, which is based, the principle of the recovery that I do is based in anonymity. And so nobody is supposed to know in real life that I had this other life as kind of a drug addict and alcoholic. But then by accident, I wrote a book about being an addict and an alcoholic. And also by accident, the book won a prize. So it's very hard to think when I'm saying like, oh yeah, I read, what's your book about? It's about being an anonymous drug addict and alcohol. I may as well get it written on one of those big T-shirts, anonymous drug addict. But it was like other people said, it's cathartic, but that's not the purpose of it. You want some levity. You want it to be entertaining. You don't want it to be what I call pour me a drink kind of literature, like woe is me. That there have been plenty of books like that, and I really didn't want this book to be like those other books. And another example of one that rose above the misery of addiction and recovery was The Outrun by Amy Liptrot.
Yes, I've read that. It's great.
Absolutely beautiful. But unfortunately, I don't know how to write about nature. So there was this great format for her to write a little bit about addiction and then say, oh yeah, but then I went and I watched birds off a cliff for like 50 pages, and it's wonderful and it's uplifting, but I don't know nature. I said, oh, that's a tree, that's a leaf, that's some water. I'm a city girl, I don't know how to write that stuff. So the only other thing that I knew at that point in my life, apart from addiction, was cleaning. So that was the basis of my longer book. And in terms of the short story that I contributed to this, when I look back on it, it's quite dark. There are moments of levity, but it's important for people to know that those of us writing this, we're not trying, even if we're trying to be funny, we're not trying to say, ha ha, is an addiction funny? There are, like all of life, there are moments of dark comedy there. And I hope that's what comes across in the collection.
Thank you. I think comedy is also a really useful way of talking about difficult things too. I think that sort of gives the space sometimes to say things that in normal circumstances are more difficult. Freud always said that it was the way of saying the difficult thing in the room is to put it in a joke. And so the laughter in the dark, I think, is also very much an important part of that. But Katie and Mike, can I come to you and ask you about, because you actually work in this area, you use storytelling to help people recover. And I'm interested in this business of storytelling and recovery, and the difference. Is there a difference between art and recovery writing, or where's the difference, or what's your knowledge about this? Because it seems to me that it's an essential part of human experience to want to tell stories.
Yeah. First of all, sorry I'm a little bit late. Just wanted to acknowledge that. Yeah, it's a really great question, and it's something that's really live for me at the moment. And a few years ago, I was given the opportunity to train with an organisation called Write Yourself, which are based in Sweden. And they train people who are interested in the role of writing in the therapeutic value of writing and how that accelerates recovery. And not just kind of recovery to do with addiction specifically, recovery in a really broad sense, and how it accelerates healing in recovery from trauma as well. And I trained, and I didn't use that for a long time, probably because of issues around my confidence, but out of COVID, because of everything going online, I was able to maximize some of the opportunities that's presented, and work with people that I wouldn't have ordinarily had the chance to work with. So I run writing groups where we look at this, where we interrogate that question, and I think storytelling and telling our own stories and writing things down can absolutely be therapeutic and really vital for recovery. And there's lots of research that substantiates this as well. I think mainly for me, it offers some sort of control over control over your experiences and what's happened to you, even if that control is only on a linguistic level. It also, writing, I also think when things are really perhaps traumatic or very difficult, writing gives us permission to tell our story in a non-linear way, and it's fundamentally a private act, isn't it? And I think that's really important. One thing I say to the writers that I work with is we tell the story to ourselves first, and then in time, if it feels right, we can then share those stories with other people. So I think it offers, because it's a fundamentally private act, writing is a private act, and we decide whether we want to share that after we've written something, that offers us an opportunity to really say what we want to say on the page, without fear of judgment, and particularly with certain experiences, really stigmatized experiences like addiction and mental health and abuse. Often we hear a lot of critical voices in society around those experiences. So writing is a way to kind of get to the heart of how we really feel about something.
I've always thought the phrase coming to terms with almost immediately suggests that when you say I have to come to terms with this thing that happened, what it actually means is I have to come into language, I have to find the words for in order to be able to process it. We think like that, I think, as a society, that the importance of narrative, and yet quite often I get leveled against creative writing workshops, for example. Oh, well, they're just a substitute for therapy. And I'm like, no, they're not. This is very fundamental. This works on a very fundamental level within the students as well.
Yeah. And the narrative, you know, what you picked up there, Julia, about narrative, apparently in the research that's happened in this field around the therapeutic value of writing, people who make the most, who kind of gain the most health benefits from doing writing about their own experiences or using their own experiences as material for stories, they gain the most benefits if they use words that kind of help build a narrative. So that have greater use of like exploratory words, like because of, or this is the cause of this. So it's like writing that helps us make links between events and feelings, and connections between and links between events can be therapeutic, because that's how we can start to understand something and then integrate it into our kind of memory.
Yes, and then we can write our own stories rather than have them written for us in a way.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just bring in Michael. Hi. So be being patient over there in the corner for your perspective on this.
Sure. Thanks, Julia. I think my connection to the book was initially purely about the recovery side of it. I hadn't really connected to the origins of the project in terms of addiction and the workshops in St Mungo's, but I had, you know, seeing the public call for material on the theme of recovery really landed with me, because I recovered from a health condition that had kind of dominated my life for about 10-15 years. And writing had been a really big part of that recovery, personally for me. So I had a lot of material, mainly poems actually, although I don't really write poetry so much anymore. But basically falling ill unleashed this kind of outbreak of creativity from me. And I really rediscovered my creativity through falling ill. And so that was my angle onto the theme of the project. And for me, lots of ways in which writing really was fundamental for me. I think it's partly, as Katie was saying, it's about processing difficult emotions and naming them, putting them into words. And for me, it was creating something artistic and therefore of inherent value out of a difficult experience. And a lot of my poems at that time, I mean, if I read them now, I'd probably think they were dreadful, but at the time they were really building my confidence, the ability to kind of wield language. And I was often working in quite strict rhyme schemes sometimes, and it gave a sense of boxing the emotion or trying to kind of structure the thinking somehow. And that was helpful too. But I think it wasn't just about the words on the page for me, and it became something much bigger than that. For me, writing started to become a whole identity. So I'd stopped work. I was a management consultant, and I had a breakdown from stress. And I was a kind of epitome of living a kind of rat race lifestyle. And then I literally was at home with not much to do except write, really. It's kind of what I connected to out of the blue. And gradually, friends who were still part of that kind of rat race lifestyle, or let's call it a kind of mainstream office type lifestyle, instead of asking me, "Oh, how's work?" because they couldn't ask me that anymore, would ask me, "How's writing going?" And it became this thing that I would talk about and feel a sense of self-esteem from, a sense of progress and confidence. And eventually, I started to think of myself gradually, after a long period of time, as a writer. It was the thing that I did. And that was very, very important to rebuilding my identity, really, over a long period of time. So, I think the first kind of group writing workshop that I went to was specifically for people who had mental health difficulties, and I was traveling a kind of 4-hour round trip across London to be somewhere where I felt safe, just to be in that workshop. It was the only place I felt comfortable to be in. And then that was a kind of gateway to places like Survivors Poetry in Camden, and then mainstream workshops too with the poetry school, and eventually I ended up doing an MA. So and in going to a lot of those kind of community workshops, I was suddenly given access to a whole kind of culture away from the mainstream, people who weren't in work necessarily, or they were in work but they were doing part-time work, or they were working but they were doing something really, really creative and interesting. And it was just a complete different world that I was suddenly getting access to. So, and in accessing that, I was also, my values were changing. I was becoming less mainstream and interested in more alternative things. And so that was a very important part of the process too. And I think also the, journaling was important too. So in the sort of classic Julia Cameron morning pages style of journaling, I did that for a long period of time. I've got, dozens of notebooks where I was just venting onto the page. Yeah. And then more recently, I've tried to get more to kind of, I still journal for kind of reflective purposes for work, and try to access it in a really creative way through prompts that I've picked up from the International Association of Journal Writers and Writing for Wellbeing networks like Lapidus. So I've kind of got this, it's my self-maintenance tool really, journaling. So although I don't necessarily, because I'm writing fiction now, I'm not necessarily writing about my own well-being or recovery, even retrospectively, but the journaling is a key part of my kind of process. And I think even with the fiction, I'm now channeling personal experiences and my interest in inner life.
Can I just ask in what way the journaling kind of is it just the daily use of language, or the writing physically? Are you doing it with a pen on paper? I know this is.
Yeah, so I do use pen on paper, but I often use dialogues. So between myself and mainly a kind of inner coach, and it's really, really illuminating. And you can also do other kinds of dialogues, like between your right hand and your left hand, and or your dominant hand and your non-dominant hand. So you're accessing the vulnerable, kind of incompetent part of yourself, whichever is your non-dominant hand, and being in dialogue with the other part of you. And it leads to just amazing insights and transformation. And it just is a process of personal discovery, really. There's very many number of creative prompts that you can use that go beyond morning pages. So sometimes morning pages in themselves, for me at least, after a while started to become a bit stagnant, where I was just venting and I wasn't really moving anywhere, and it just became quite stuck. And I was finding I would have to write for like an hour before I started to see some sort of transformation of mood. Whereas if you use other kinds of prompts, then you can speed up that process of shifting your mental state.
It forces you into a dialogue rather than into a flat space somehow. I think it's more dynamic, perhaps.
Yeah, and you can create a bit like writing tutors will introduce restrictions on writing a poem, like write a poem that rhymes every other line, or write a poem that's only got 10 syllables in each line, or write a poem that every line begins with the letter A. Whatever restriction you're going to impose, you can also impose restrictions in your journaling, so that you're let's say you might journal with only 5 words in every sentence, and again you're just doing things that shift your mental state into some other state, and that can be part of helping you to recover from just feeling grumpy or feeling stuck, or however severe the mood state you're in is, really.
And you've written a guide about how to write a novella, I think. Was that on your
I'm
website?
working on it, so
you're working on it, okay.
Yeah. To further, yeah, it's a bit more to be done, but so my first book was a novella in Flash, and I've kind of gradually done more and more teaching in that form, a kind of short novel composed of miniature stories. And so I was asked to write a guide to the form, and that hopefully will be out at the end of the year.
And I think, Katie, you've got something too. You have a guide on writing yourself. Is that right? Is that online, or is that a... Sorry, I muted you.
No, it's not a book, but it's a 8-week program.
Okay.
That runs online, and at the moment anyway, and it does run face to face as well.
Can people join in on that through your web, or contact you through your website if they're interested in that?
My website isn't live yet, but people can contact me directly. I can give some details.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to ask, before I ask you guys to just give us a reading, I wanted to just finally ask both Lily and Zoe to share the title, because it's such a beautiful title. I do know where it comes from, but some people might not. And why did you choose it?
A Wild and Precious Life. That was nice, wasn't it, Zoe? We were trying to, we did a kind of brainstorm of titles with Alex at the Recovery Service, and we had no idea what to call it, but it was it came into my head because I was at a complete crossroads in my life. I was going through a separation. I'd met a new man, and I did remember turning to, it's slightly corny, but I turned to him and I said, what would you do with this one wild and precious life? Because I thought it was I don't know if that's completely saying the right, I think I'm paraphrasing slightly, but we were both at this point where we had to make a leap, and just this sense of how precious our time was. So this resonated with me at that particular point in my life. But of course, in terms of the anthology, it just sounded perfect because it was acknowledging the wildness of people's lives and their choices, and you know what had driven them to do the things that they did, which we sort of saw as a celebratory thing, and also acknowledging the preciousness of that and the preciousness of fragility. So it kind of encapsulated both of those elements for us, I think. Zoe, was there anything else that we sort of landed on with that?
No, I think it was a conversation we were having with Alex at the at St Mungo's, wasn't it, about, well, what could we possibly call this? And I remember you mentioning the poem, and we all three of us just said, well, yes, that's it. But you're right, I think we've borne it in mind while we've been reading and through this whole process. And those two words, wild and precious, you can interpret them so many different personal ways, but wildness in particular, it seems to be a concept that's been rising in the zeitgeist, certainly in the worlds of writing and fiction that I inhabit. And to acknowledge, yes, that this isn't about becoming good or better, but just, yeah, being able to appreciate your life, whatever shape it is, I think was really important. And I guess that, you know, we can't use the whole Mary Oliver poem. We've just borrowed a little bit of it for the title because it's someone else's work. But there's an emotion or an attitude in that poem that felt right as well, I think. Life affirming.
Yes, I mean, I really want to congratulate you both on such a fantastic project. I mean, the fundraising in itself isn't easy. It's also just a celebration of our own human frailty and vulnerability. I've got a poem in it about another period in my life, which I might share with people at some point, but I was very proud to be included in it. And I think the story behind it, and also the sort of crowd that you built around it, so that it means that it's going to be quite an impactful piece of work. It's something that people are going to look at and think, actually, yeah, it's okay to sit down and write my story, and maybe one day I can write that story and make it something that will get published, or maybe I'll just write my story and that will be enough. And I think that example in and of itself is incredible. And it's also something that I've always tried to practice in my own teaching practice. Not everybody who comes to study on an MA is going to necessarily win the book a prize, nor should they. And actually sometimes just being able to produce something which is a very good, honest, accurate reflection of their own life experiences is enough. You can see people's lives changing because they're able to achieve that at the end of a degree. And that seems to me to be a sort of important part of the process too, that quite often gets glossed over by the academic conversation around teaching practice and so on. We ignore the vulnerability of the students in the room who are sharing all of these things. And I feel as a teacher that this book honors that process also. So yeah, I want to congratulate you on the publication. I'm really looking forward to actually getting my hands on the copy of it very soon. So could I ask you to share some work? I'm sorry I didn't come up with a schedule first. Michelle, are you happy to go first, and then Katie and Michael to finish us off, just to read
Can I just ask, just because
Of course.
I know Katie's up against it time.
sure.
Katie, would you like to slip away if you go first, or are you?
Sorry, yeah.
No, I think as long as I can shoot out at 3, that should be fine.
Okay.
Thank you, though.
Go, Michelle.
Right. So are we all right for sound?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I'll read a short extract from the story, which is about when, certainly in my addiction and many other people's addiction lives, life gets very, very small, and you just sort of go between where you live to the shop and back again. And in fact, it's kind of reflected the way a lot of people have been dealing with lockdown as well. Life that used to be very big is suddenly very small. So it's kind of about that theme. And when my life was going between where I lived, which was a little bedsit, and an internet shop where I use the internet shop. I go to the Somalian internet shop to use the computer, putting a pound coin on the counter and 50 pence in the Somalian relief box. Mustafa, as usual, is watching a harrowing video of the famine in his mother country. And they're all variations on the same theme: a widowed woman, her starving child crossing a barren land, digging up inedible roots and sucking on them. The kid dies. She buries him in the sand, flies all around her face, and she's too beaten down to brush them off. Mustafa stops looking at the film and greets me warmly, if erroneously. Michelle Obama! It's a running joke that long since ran out on me, because there's another American lady called Michelle, only she's first lady. There's a broken fridge stocked with lukewarm orange fizzy drinks, and the shop smells like old rice and people who don't bathe. He says, "How is Barack?" I say, "Oh, you know, running the country and stuff." He says, "Have you told him what's going on in Somalia? Will he help?" I say, "He's working on it." And it's easier to get, to play along with, you know, to get over with, to get into my little cubicle and swallow some pills and take sly slips out of the flat bottle. I'm working on a long piece about becoming an alcoholic, but I never get to the end because I'm still drinking. I've sent sections to a publisher who says she doesn't want to publish it because she doesn't know how it's going to end, and that I will regret writing in a book the feelings I had around my family, the family I left. But she suggests that one day I will regret writing these things down, and she's not wrong. And I'll finish on this. I type a few lines and take a few sips when Mustafa prepares for one of his 5 daily prayers. He asks me to mind the shop while he goes to the toilet for his ablutions. These include washing his nostrils out with water. So he emerges from the loo with a dripping nose. I say, "Don't shit me, Mustafa, you're doing lines of coke back there, aren't you?" And he looks confused and says he would never put Coca-Cola up his nose.
Fantastic, thank you. Katie.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I read a short extract from a poem I wrote for the anthology, and it's a section towards the end, and it's called How Trauma Works. What I wouldn't give to look into the Earth's core and see tectonic plates moving so I could prepare a bomb shelter for later. what I wouldn't give to measure myself on the Richter scale and know exactly where I am in terms of devastation potential. What they don't tell you about trauma is that it will make you feel like you're not the expert of your own life anymore. About how at 3 a.m. you might wake up to realize the coat hanging on the back of your door, the coat you hold around you in winter, is actually a shapeshifter, and it's morphed itself in the night into the outline of him, and your imagination is filling in the gaps. About how at 4 a.m. you might wake to check the latch, the bolts, check the locks, check all windows, all doors, check the floor hasn't slipped away beneath you, check your body is still here and intact, check you still have a reflection in the mirror and that it's moving, check your partner hasn't stopped breathing, check you haven't rolled over during a nightmare only to suffocate your dog, check your car and door keys are out of sight, just in case someone can fit their hand through the letterbox and steal entry to your whole life. Check and check again. All the advice is focused on fixing yourself, but fixing is not the same as healing. Putting on a plaster is not an act of love to the body. And no one has the guts, the bravery to tell you about other ways to heal. That just maybe you have to look trauma in the eyes, shake its hand and tell it that you know it's real. Tell it that you see it, that you really see it, and it doesn't have to plead for your attention anymore. Tell it you can no longer live here, just outside my door. There will be a language barrier at first, but healing begins its biggest journey when you allow trauma in over the threshold of your home.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Katie. And we can read the whole piece in the Wild and Precious Life. That's really lovely. Thank you so much. Michael, finish us off.
Thanks, Julia. When Zoe and Lily were talking about the title, Wild and Precious Life, from the Mary Oliver poem, what came up for me was the ecological concept of rewilding. And I think there's something about how, for me, recovery was about learning about and embracing a kind of wild self and treating it as precious in the way that people are trying to do with rewilding in nature too. So I just wanted to mention that. So my poem, I'm just going to read one poem. It's called Spoons, and it's written, it was inspired by a Philip Larkin poem called Water, which begins, if I were called in to construct a religion, I should make use of water. Spoons. If I were called in to construct a psych ward, I should make use of spoons. Tools for obligatory chicken soup, that friend for our yellowing, yearning bellies. Spoonerisms, lame for giving a language that's betrayed us. And every nightfall, patients should bed down together, the body in curved embrace, infinite bliss of our huggable selves.
Oh, that's just a perfect place to end. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for joining me this afternoon. That was really kind. I hope everybody enjoyed that, and also to remember to get the book. It's out on the 13th of May. Is it going to have a paperback release as well as a hardback?
Yes.
Yes. So yeah, there'll be 2 versions of the book coming out. You're going to hear a lot more about it. I think this is a real game changer of a collective anthology, and there's some fantastic work in it. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining me today.